Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. So today we're going to talk about tools in the toolkit. There was some discussion among some of the regular folks participate in this session about methods in public procurement to do things that are the right fit for the right project. There's a lot of times where the traditional RFP, which is a workhorse on the farm, sometimes gets described as not the right fit for everything because its structure tends to emphasize longer cycles and lots of requirements. Earlier in the year, I highlighted some stuff that Michigan was doing. We have somebody from Michigan in the audience, so there's also different ways to try to be able to create more active conversation or interactions with people based on the kind of tools that we use. So with that, Jaime, you usually give us a kickoff into some of our conversations. How do we add some tools to the toolkit on the way we go to market in a way that is going to be effective?
So, Dustin, I think it's important, right? I usually kick it off by saying, what is X, right? And so I think I want to just take a step back to open us up today to talk about what is creativity or innovation in procurement. And I've kind of broken it down into 4 different aspects to help frame the conversation today. So number 1 would be innovative operational procurement, whereby we're performing our procurement procedures in an innovative manner. So California, for example, released an RFI squared a few years ago. That would be an example of innovative operational procurement. Number 2 would be innovation in procurement strategy. So positioning the procurement work in a strategically different manner. And Dustin, I'll probably turn it back over to you to talk about this in just a minute, because you and I have had lengthy conversations about transforming government procurement operations from a transactional group to really performing high-level analytics in procurement and anticipating the future. You and I have talked about the ARC and all the things, so I don't want to give away your spiel on that. Number 3 is buying innovative goods and services, so otherwise known really as procurement of innovation. So how do we buy innovative, new, and early stage goods? 5G, new and upcoming medical products, drones, technology. And then lastly, number 4 is encouraging innovation from every and any supplier contract. So as a government procurement officer in every procurement exercise, we should seek out and encourage innovative ideas and plans, whether it's construction or a new IT system, a legal agreement, drones. It should be delivered in an innovative manner that drives better value. So along all 4 of those verticals, I would just add, what are we looking for as CPOs in the government? What do we want to buy? And so I broke it out into just a couple different areas. I think tech is number 1, right? We want drones, we want 5G, we want new, very agile, dynamic systems. Telematics. We want systems that can predict behavior in the future to make our procurement lives a little bit easier, and we can anticipate what's coming. And I know Jenny just jumped on. We want to be able to mitigate the risk before it happens and it's sitting in our laps. Enhancements around predicting behavior from all realms of government. US made goods, that is a big topic among legislators across the country. Most governments would rather pay a little bit more for the goods and have them made in the US to support the local economy. Lastly, this was a really cool concept that I found out about at the NASPO Exchange conference a week or 2 ago. How about vending machines for X, right? Not candy bars, not soda. How about vending machines for PPE, right? Masks may not go away tomorrow. They may be here for another year. How about vending machines for Purell? All the things that we in state government need to maintain on a daily basis, right? So, Dustin, I think that's my kickoff. So what is innovation? It's those 4 verticals, and then what are we really looking to buy? How can we apply that to those 4 verticals?
Yeah, the RFI squared thing for California is interesting. because the process it was talking about there is saying, basically, we're going to describe a problem, and then we want to allow people to bring in different types of answers that aren't constrained by a million requirements in order to then judge which was closest, and then we'll fund proof of concepts within that. And I think that California made a good start with that. I think that if you look at some stuff that Michigan did in the last year, and Jared's in the audience, Jared, if you're involved and you want to talk about it, then please feel free to raise up and come up. But I interviewed Jim Colangelo earlier in the year, and he was talking about these competitive proof of concepts where they build into the RFP process the actual ability to touch and feel things in the middle. So it was a planned part of the acquisition. So it's kind of problem statement style, but it just comes at it a different way. And if we can stay for a minute on the question about how do we make sure that our procurement events leave enough space for innovation so that we can actually find the experts in the process of doing discussions.
Time is not always our friend in the procurement world. I'll just say that.
So Jared, you joined us, and I just referenced Michigan a little bit. So are you involved in that competitive proof of concept approach?
In Michigan, we have a few things that kind of speak to this. The competitive proof of concept being one of the first creative solicitation types that we developed. What we were really running into was business groups were entering into proof of concepts with companies unbeknownst to procurement, and then coming to the table after the fact saying, we want to contract with this company. And due to the fact that they didn't go through a competitive process, we would tell them, well, now we have to put it out to RFP. And they would get frustrated and, just complain about public procurement taking forever, what have you. And so we came up with the idea of what if we did the proofs of concepts in a competitive environment. Similar to an RFP, we put out a shortened statement of work with some shortened requirements, ask bidders to put forward a no-cost proof of concept to the state that then we can use for our evaluation cycle, and then move to contract directly from that. So it kind of met the business areas at where they were at, what they were already doing, and kind of wrapped the procurement around that. The other piece that we're currently piloting right now is what we're calling a request for a solution. So this really takes the RFP process and boils it down to, what is your end goal? What are you trying to achieve? Forget process, forget requirements, forget user stories. What is your goal? Well, what at the end of the day do you need? Do you need a database that does X, Y, Z? Do you need a website interface that can connect with stakeholders throughout the state? What have you? Come up with that problem statement. Assign best value criteria, not scoring criteria, but best value criteria. What are you going to use to evaluate the vendor's responses, and then put it out to the vendor community and allow them to propose a solution that meets your end goal. So, if we're talking a call center or a customer-facing response center, let's say, one vendor might propose, an AI solution that you pre-populate with, let's say 1,000 responses or 10,000 responses, whatever, that can just interact with people as they raise questions. Well, for that same goal, another vendor might propose to you an actual call center with staff, right? Two completely different approaches to meeting the same goal. Then you allow the business area, along with procurement, to evaluate those approaches to figure out which one is the best fit for them. And it ends up being, a subjective decision, one that's a little bit less restrictive than, a typical RFP with scoring. But it allows you to let the market bring to you ideas that you may have not previously even contemplated. We're not always the smartest people in the room. We don't always know the category 100%. So why don't we let some of our private sector companies bring solutions to the table to us that meet our goal, as opposed to over prescribing, a process or procedure that we want them to follow.
Jenny, we were talking about getting creative and managing risk, and I'm interested in what you think about what Jaime and Jared have contributed so far. If that's stuff that you're thinking about, or I mean, you're also over you're a contracting counsel as well, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. So why don't you jump in?
Sure. This is Jenny, and I'm in the Office of the Comptroller in Massachusetts. So all the contracts of the state ultimately come through our office or are recorded in our accounting system. So what Jaime and Jared have outlined are, fantastic ideas and really the way that we're going. From a risk perspective, I think you're dealing with two different things on the kind of continuum of fear that drives a lot of decision making. One is that from the audit perspective, on one end, there is a very low appetite risk for fraud. So a lot of the procurement rules are built to really restrict decision making so that you get the lowest cost as opposed to best value. That is changing, but still a lot of municipalities are you have to go with the least cost responsive bidder. So you have a lot less flexibility. And on the far end, you have on the risk appetite is departments who are not considering risk or security or privacy at all in their procurements, and they're buying something for operational needs as opposed to really thinking about what could potentially go wrong. And one example are the unemployment systems that are used across the country are fantastic at doing what they were designed to do, and they've been doing it for years. And no one ever presumed that we would go through a pandemic and then they would become the number one target for hackers. So even though many of the systems have done a very good job at building up their resilience, it's still something that needs to be front and center now when you're doing procurements. And I think people have kind of forgotten what the whole role of procurement is. The procurement really was designed to create an open and fair opportunity to everybody. It wasn't meant to be restrictive. So I think when you think of it that way, you really need to be more innovative in this type of world that we're living in now. We have to be prepared in the future for future types of pandemics or future types of disaster. And I think people are really pushing towards being more flexible. But at the same time, building in the controls so that you're not going to be opening yourself up to fraud or waste and abuse because you're moving too fast and being too innovative. So what I'd really like to see is kind of a two-step approach where, as Jared is talking about, you're bringing in these opportunities and really testing them, and then also building in more innovation. So when it's tested and you know it can work, then it goes mainstream. And then pushing tech to be thinking about all of these security and privacy and kind of operational stability ideas as they're building, instead of when it breaks and then they're fixing it when we're trying to be doing operations as government.
Jenny, this is Jaime. You could not be more spot on with your comments, especially as it relates to technology, mitigating risk, timeline, and being innovative. It feels a little bit like a perfect storm at times when you're looking at purchasing technology in a quick manner, mitigating risk. And I know that I myself personally will say I don't think we have the magic formula quite right yet.
This is James Crenshaw with the Office of Contracts at DC Office of Contracts. I was listening to Jared's statement, and it kind of brought a smile, a little bit of a laugh to me, thinking back to some challenges we had, not in DC, but with a previous procurement department, dealing with scope with some of our user agencies. The user agencies were having issues with scope, and we were getting several amendment questions, addendum questions, and our initial solution was, well, maybe we just need to put out an RFI or maybe a request for proposals for consultant services. And then I hear Jared talk about request for a solution, and that's just that's something I never thought of. I never thought of, but that's definitely a tool that can be utilized going forward, that you can help skip, an RFP to bring a consultant in to do consultant services for all of your scope of services for your user department. If we put out a request for a solution, we can get to that same need, get that need accomplished without that extra RFP in front of it. I think the one challenge that, the first start what we will have is finding where or how to implement a new procurement solution within our organization. As we know, many of our organizations, we are we are stuck to our, whether we have 7 or 9 procurement solutions, we're stuck to those. And if 1 or 2 try to come in, we get a little nervous about them. So that's something I just want to just a little thank you to Jared on that one. I never heard of a request for solutions. So that's a good tool that I'm looking to start trying to implement.
Yeah, the feds do statement of objective style bids, which can be a little bit more open. And then, we did a little bit more problem statement style in the recent bid we did with Hawaii, where obviously there was a lot of requirements in that bid, but we also had certain areas where we weren't 100% sure what the solution was. So we tried to set the outer frame and invited vendors to be able to say what their expertise would say needed to happen. And honestly, I got more questions about some of the open gates. It's almost like you have a horse that's used to being inside of the gate, and then you open the gate and they look at you like, what am I supposed to do with that? Right? Vendors are used to, they both complain about the high requirement RFPs, and then you give them a chance to have one where they can answer, and they vapor lock because they don't know what to do with the open space. So it is interesting trying to break the paradigms while staying within things that people are comfortable with. Jonathan, we just did a training with you guys in Louisiana with like 280 people, where we were trying to both talk about what's good in RFPs and how to instill some creativity and some solution-based approach, as opposed to just the tried and true, exactly what we've done before. So what did you take out of some of that, and or what are some things you're looking to do in Louisiana to try to open it up a little bit?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to what I was going to suggest, which is that especially for those who have some level of hesitation, or that they anticipate that their organization would have some level of hesitation, or they don't think it likely that they'd be able to run the gamut of getting organizational approval for a new method. What I would encourage, going back to what Jaime said earlier, is that in addition to having innovative methods or innovative means, you also have the ability to pursue innovative ends using traditional or familiar means. And that's where we've had the biggest bang for our buck so far in Louisiana, using solutions like the RFP, which of course is well familiar, but starting to change how we use it. Traditionally, Louisiana has been very prescriptive, where we started doing RFPs initially, and this was before my time, but we started doing RFPs because the attorneys told us that the RFP is like a bid, except you can negotiate and you can do a best and final offer. And so when that's the framing for a method, obviously it shapes how it gets used. And of course, over time, we've asking for proposals, multiple solutions or multiple offerings that fit the need rather than nailing it down. It's an ongoing challenge, but one good example, I think, that really answers your question well and segues to the topic of flexibility with innovative ends rather than necessarily innovative means, is we have a third-party financing contract. We call it IPM. And we established it by RFP, and we, essentially use the RFP as a pre-qualification vehicle. We were able to screen through the qualified vendors, and then after that, without having to do separate bids every time we need third-party financing, we have a market of pre-qualified financiers that are subject to master terms and conditions, reporting requirements, et cetera. And whenever we have a financing need come through, we can do a 1-week mini solicitation, and they respond to it, again, working off of the master contract they already have. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not leveraging a brand new solicitation type. We're using something as old and familiar as the RFP process to accomplish a really innovative end. I don't think I'm saying anything appropriate by the solution is so innovative that we actually submitted it for the Cronin this year. We hope. We're optimistic. We're hopeful. So I want to give encouragement to anybody listening out there that it doesn't have to be a whiz-bang solution. It doesn't have to be an RFI squared. It doesn't have to be a request for solution. It can be as simple as being open to adapting familiar tools in the toolbox and seeing if there may be an alternate or value-added use for them.
I'm a huge fan of two-step RFPs that are used to organize categories. I think it's super effective. When I was stateside with Texas, we did a lot of those. Probably my favorite one was when we redid print shops, because there was a responsibility to let the internal state shops bid on work, but then also have a fallout way to deal with external print shops that may want cuts at the work. So we did interagency contracts with all of the print shops and had an agreement as to the form and the method by which agencies would request, and that same form would be used to push information out to the private sector if the internals passed on the work. And so two-step vendor pool type of things don't have to just be unmanaged, untended IDIQs. They can be very focused and create a machine and a process that creates a lot of flexibility. We've used those kind of tools in several different markets. Christin, you haven't had a chime in yet, or anything that you're interested in or excited about, or a tool that you're looking for to add to your toolkit?
I jumped in on the conversation. I'm sorry, Christin Webb, Shelby County Government Purchasing Office, but I didn't necessarily have a tool that I've been exploring, but the RFS is interesting to hear of that. But the one thing that has resonated with me, and I probably feel like I'm going to go super left, for us, I think our toolkit includes cultural changes, because the best tool or the best RFP, RFS, you can come up with it, but a lot of times, I find that our departments kind of, aren't as proactive as they could be. And so I think, creating those cultural changes to encourage the departments to become more proactive so that they can get RFSs out, in a fashion that allows them to really explore the market. And then obviously knowing exactly what it is they're looking for, maybe not the specifics, but just having a general idea of, what is the problem and what's the outcome, as you all mentioned about the problem statement. So I feel like my response is a little left. Mine is more culturally and behavior based, but I will say that RFS does sound interesting. And I even like the follow-up on maybe how to get operational approval of the RFS, because we currently don't use it, and it is kind of a new tool for me. So I definitely will be exploring it. So that's all I have for now, though. Thanks for everybody's feedback so far.
So Jaime, you laid out an aggressively comprehensive list of things that you thought were in this topic. So where are we on your list, and where would you like to take us from your prep?
Oh, I think, James, I'm going to go back to a comment that you made. What are the barriers to adopting new procurement approaches? Barriers are everywhere. And Christin, I think you even just mentioned it, right? It's thoughts in our mind. It's the risk. It's scary. It's new. Things could go wrong. But then you've got those little things like statutes and rules, right? CPOs always go back to, well, it's not in our statute, so we can't do it. And it's not very often that we will get guidance from our Attorney General's office that says, well, the statute is silent on topic X. So yeah, go ahead and do whatever you want to, right? That's just not the guidance that we receive. So I'm curious from others, I'll open it up to the group. What are the barriers that you're experiencing to getting across to new innovative ways? And then just before I stop talking, I just want to put it out there that when my team comes to me with ideas of innovation, whether it's an RFI, right, triplicate, or whether, whatever it may be, whether it's a method or something new that we want to buy, I ask them two questions. What problem are you trying to solve? And what problems will this idea create? Right? And so if you just let them think about that, what are you trying to solve, and what problems will your idea create? If you can answer both of those questions reasonably, then it's probably a great idea and you can move forward. So again, I go back to those barriers, and I'll open that up for the group.
That's a great segue. I actually wanted to, I wrote down innovation in policy. I have a love-hate relationship with bids, at least for the municipalities that I've worked for. For example, some of the policies that I've worked under, you can't negotiate bids, or you can't ask for clarifying questions. And so I've seen situations where on some pass-fail bids, maybe a low bidder didn't clarify that their company can do XYZ the exact way that we specified, and the bid is thrown out. And then when they ask for a debrief, we talk to them and they say, oh, well, I meant to say that I was saying that this way, but I just wasn't clear. Had you asked me a clarifying question, I would have been the winner. And then we have to go back to, well, policy 27.123 says bids, we can't ask clarifying questions. We can't negotiate. So I want to look at those policies and see why are they there today, and if they still apply today. I understand they may have been great years ago, but like we said, RFPs and bids, they're not that much different, other than, for me, one, that we can negotiate and you take the lowest bidder, and bids are, but you're not necessarily always getting the best value when you can't maximize on some of those things like questions and negotiating.
I mean, everybody has different tolerances on that. I would say, to me, bids should only be used when a few specific conditions exist. One is we are at an equivalent level of understanding as the buyers as the sellers are, which means to say we know what rock salt we want, we know what granularity we want, we know what proof that you have demonstrated that it lasts for 6 hours, right? So we have to really know the market, number one. Number two, we have to be able to fairly exhaustively describe any moving screw in the fuselage, so that the only thing left to discuss is price, right? Once we agree the kind of road salt that I want and how much that I want, then the only thing left to talk about is price. If you're concerned that within that you need to create some ability to have some best value equivalence, then that's where you play with your responsive and responsible criteria on what it means to be a vendor that can respond. If you're worried that people are going to not bid correctly, but otherwise bids are sealed bids, and you can open them in front of people and show the prices and say who won on the spot. So they should be used for those kind of things. I know some people may have different opinions on how far they can take an IFB, but that's as far as I would take it. If you want to consider things like solution approach or methodology or qualifications of the team, extra value added services, the rest of the thing, and you're doing a best value solicitations, IFBs just don't carry that water. So if you're trying to create open space, use IFBs for the tool that they are. Jaime, tell me what you think or don't think about that.
Well, I'm going to challenge you just a little bit, Dustin, because I'm curious as to how you would handle this situation. Public procurement official is used to doing an IFB then you're going to hear the classic statement, but I've always done it this way, right? So there's the comfort level. I've always done it this way. It's always been successful. We think we've always achieved best value. How do you talk them into utilizing creativity and innovation, or even just saying that's a tool that works, but it's not the best tool?
RFPs or their variants that are even more flexible than RFPs should be about creating a space to find the expert. IFBs assume that you are the expert and that you're talking with other experts, and the only thing left to talk about is price. So I would tell those people, if you want to talk about anything other than price, then consider whether we're using the right tool. I don't know, Christin, any follow-up on that?
I think it's about the conversation. I guess what came to mind is within the constraints of public records, obviously, I think showing examples of the success of an RFP, maybe on similar type projects, is one way to get the buy-in and win them over. And I think obviously it lends back to trust and relationship building between the purchasing office and the user areas. So I think a lot of times if you can make sure that those two things are intact, they kind of learn to trust your expertise. Not an easy task. I don't at all say that it is that, but I have seen us be able to offer solutions. I like to call my team a solution provider to our users, so that they understand that while they may come ask for one thing, we're going to suggest something that's going to be much more effective. And over time, I do see them lending more to what our recommendations are. So if it's going from a seal bid or an IFB to, hey, I really think you're going to get exactly what you're looking for times 10 if we go through this RFP process. We've seen it be effective, and now we have those examples to kind of lean in on for those departments that are kind of stuck on doing the bids solely. But I will say I'm not against bids at all. I definitely think they have their place. But RFPs, I do think offer, or even RFQs for that matter, offer much more insight to what can be done to provide the best solution.
That's a great point, Kristen. And I'll just quickly follow up. When I'm working on a procurement solution, the first thing I'm thinking about is what is going to be the best benefit to the number one, the taxpayer, and number two, the user department. And when we're in a situation when we can't take an action that's best for the taxpayer and the user department simply because of the name of the solution, then that's challenging for me. So if I had simply went with an RFP instead of an IFB, then I can do my clarifying questions, I can do my negotiations. So what I'm saying, and when we talk about change in policy, maybe we create some policy that says, okay, yeah, these are the standards for IFBs. However, if this happens, this certain situation happens, then this allows you to go and ask a clarifying question. Or maybe you put a threshold on it. You can't negotiate an IFB more than 5% of your planned budget for the project. Or you can only ask clarifying questions if all of the bids required clarifying questions. And where the clarifying questions come from, IT solutions, when you're doing bids for like subscriptions, those bids, the subscription is what you're bidding on, but it also sometimes requires a service and a maintenance package. And our IT departments sometimes want to know that the companies that are coming to provide the service and maintenance can do it in a certain time frame, can provide certain levels of service providers and things of that nature. And that's not always answered in the bid. And I think we should find a way to be able to do that. So that's where I was at with that. I don't like to just limit bids to, sometimes when we say it's just about the price, it feels like you're limited to a bid to just goods, and it has service in it as well.
Coming up out of just the comparison of those two, there's even like many more creative ways to bring things to the table. And I think that it comes to that, how consultative is procurement allowed to be? Jaime teed up the ball a minute ago about, we talk a lot about purchasing as the management as transaction management, and procurement as that layer of intelligence that goes around the purchasing activity. And how do we create enough opportunity to have that consultative relationship with our clients that says, what problem are we trying to solve? You don't need to be the sourcing expert. I'm the sourcing expert. Tell me how you're going to know that you've solved these problems, and how are you going to measure it? And then let's find the right tool. So Raj, I know you guys just did a webinar like last week with Minnesota where they're implementing challenge solicitation style approach. So, I'm very interested in how people are going way out of the box and trying to adopt some new models. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about what Minnesota was doing, and then if you have any other comments, then please add them in.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dustin, and hi everyone. Happy to share. I think I just listened in for a minute. I've got a crazy schedule today, so I'm sorry I jumped in the car. So I hope the signal's okay. I think, the Minnesota, we're going to post the video for it. So if anybody wants to see, I would definitely recommend watching that because it was very informative. I think the challenge we're talking about in the last couple of minutes I just heard, right, is are we, defining kind of the right problem statement to start? That is the beginning point, right? Is of everything is what's the need, and obviously if it's a common buy, common purchase, that might be predetermined, pretty normal, right? But for a lot of services, it's not that well defined, right? What's the problem statement? And people come with a lot of preordained solutions already in mind. And then the second part is, what are you trying to achieve? What are the outcomes? And Dustin, in terms of, trying to get to the answer those two things and then come up with requirements, that's where, the engagement of the industry part is really where there's a huge opportunity, and one we saw, for instance, with Minnesota. Now, they're going with, the whole automated vehicle challenge, and their executive director of transportation was on. So really the program and what was great about that case study was, one, from the beginning, which you just mentioned, the program, in this case, the director of transportation and their office, was very much working closely together with the procurement staff, office of the chief procurement officer. So that's a great example, because that's what you want every time, right? Because them to be on the same page. And then they set up an engagement process with industry from the beginning to float out really problem statements. And I think they're going to share some of that with us, so we can put that out there so others can see. But that's what you exactly want to do, right? When you don't know for sure what's happening in the industry, or I would suppose that even you don't have to go that far, that the industry is brand new and the technology is completely changing. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm sure all of us have seen, right? There's a lot of experienced hands over here, so I'm sure all of us have seen this. There's an opportunity. We presuppose that we know the answer, and let's put together a book of requirements. It's really critical. I think a lot of these new approaches, they do away with the notion that we know what's happening in industry. We know how to specify the requirement. If we're going to spend a lot of money, it's really incumbent upon us to engage those people we're going to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars with, right? And use their expertise. Otherwise, why are we hiring them? That's the question I ask. Why are we going out to market and hiring these experts if we already know the answer? So it's really important to engage them early on in the process, and that's what Minnesota did. And they brought in, now they've set up a whole collaborative where there's all these different industry partners, not just for the one procurement they shared, but for other challenges coming up. So now they've set up an ongoing process where they're continuously engaging with that, that this very fast developing space. But so I think those are the kind of the couple of things I would say, Dustin, just to pause here for a second. One is great collaboration between the ultimate customer and the procurement office, right? Two, there was going in and understanding that we don't know what's going on in industry. And I think we can use a broader lens across many categories, and even things we may have bought, and go out and really try to engage industry early and get them at the table so they can help us think about the problem statement, even the outcomes. That's what I've seen in my experience. Sometimes we may not have defined the outcomes properly, and they can help us think about that and then come up with whatever requirement. And then I think the last part is, how do you go to market then, right? Meaning what's the acquisition or procurement strategy, solicitation strategy? I think that just comes down then to, you now understand the market a bit, and what's the best way to engage these players right now. If you're in a relatively kind of, in that Minnesota example, a lot of new vendors, a lot of emerging tech coming out. We need more nimble approaches, so they use the challenge-based approach. And also, I think from what I recall, it's kind of, they'll continue to add vendors as they go because the industry's changing. So I think that early market research and engagement gives you the ability to then say, okay, what's our right strategy? Anyways, hope that makes sense. I'm sorry I rambled on for a little bit.
I think the challenge bid kind of approach tends to really turn things on its ear and say, here's the problem, and we'll make awards based on your presentation. The feds do the challenge.gov, which I've always considered or encouraged states to look at that and think as to whether or not they could have some concepts like what is there. I think it's very interesting and exciting.
Hey, Dustin, if I could just add one quick remark there based on what you just said. I think you're absolutely right. The challenge-based approach, and even in the traditional, if you're putting out a request for a proposal, I think sometimes we've found that people specify a lot of requirements because that's how they know how to evaluate requirements and then put together really stringent evaluation criteria. And if you leave it open, right, and say, okay, well, we know the problem, we know the outcomes, give us your solution, they don't know exactly how to evaluate the solutions then. And that's what we've seen. Many times people then end up leaning back towards the traditional approach and specifying really detailed evaluation criteria rather than thinking about, okay, how are we going to evaluate these solutions? And I'd be curious also of how others have dealt with that. But we found that as a root cause behind some of the way things happen, even when we know it's better to do a challenge-based or a problem statement instead of a requirement statement. We don't know how we'll evaluate.
Raj, we bumped up against that in the state of Maine. A couple of years ago, I pushed on a few RFPs just to test the waters around the outcomes-based RFP, right? What's the goal that we're attempting to accomplish? What do we want the vendor to come in and help solve for us? The challenge really becomes comparing apples to apples, making sure that the vendors understand what is required of them. And then separately, the appeal process afterwards, particularly in our state, I can't speak for other states, but we have found that the litigation behind that can be complicated and confusing, especially if we don't have proper instructions, if we're not clear enough. And that's where I think you made a good point around collaboration and communication. That seems to be a consistent theme throughout these talks that we've had week after week. Without the proper collaboration and communication between the state and the potential bidders or the vendors, the outcome-based RFP becomes a little bit more challenging. So I love the approach, Dustin, that you said earlier in a two-step RFP or a multi-step RFP. If you can take even a short pause throughout the process, maybe you need to reset, maybe you need to have another conversation with your vendors. And state officials need to understand that vendors could push back on them to be more open, to be more collaborative, to say, you want to accomplish this goal, but how about incorporating this, which will help you, achieve X, Y, and Z. So I'm kind of speaking in a little bit of open terms on purpose. But again, going back to that communication and collaboration, it is just, it cannot be any more critical of a component when you're thinking about innovation and public procurement.
One part of it, I think, is being able to lift the cone of silence that is sort of the inherent understanding of what an RFP is, and having a process that allows for that, right? So, Debbie Dennis was in and out of the room a little while ago. I know on a bid that I looked at for back in the day, they had a particular bid where they had multiple rounds built into the bid, and then different things that happened at different rounds that allowed them to have additional conversations. I thought that was very clever. Some of the data center bids that I've seen have allowed for a period in the middle where they down select to 2, and then they allow the vendors to come in and validate their assumptions in order to have a final BAFO round. But then there's an opportunity that's built in to be able to have discussions with the team so that everyone's working on the same set of assumptions. I've seen solicitations that include, as part of the evaluation process, in addition to both the orals, like actual interviews with the project manager, and then they score the project manager. Again, trying to give some weight to being able to have conversations and know who you're actually dealing with. Sometimes that's probably the hardest part of the RFPs is it's all just words on paper, and there's not an ability to know who you're working with and find the expert by interacting. So I think those are smaller things that can be in part, but trying to trying to think about how we both follow the process and are able to survive through a protest process, but actually learn in the process of doing the RFP, I think is really laudable. Jared, I don't know if you're still with us. That was one of the things that was impressive to me about the proof of concept thing that James and I talked about in the day, is that it built that touch and feel into the process. If you're still with us, give us some final thoughts on that.
So we do kind of that two-step, right? We evaluate their initial what I would consider like their technical response, and then we do a secondary evaluation of their actual the work that they performed during the CPC. The other thing that we've done, and depending on your statutes, you may or may not be able to do with our request for a solution, is that we limit the protest to procedural or like legal issues, basically like gross discrepancies upon the state. We do not allow for our subjective decisions to be protested. And we call that right out in the solicitation when we do it. So far, we haven't had any protests to have to defend against, but kind of something we proactively did with that in mind. Luckily, in Michigan, we have established case law that says disappointed bidders have no standing. And so that kind of protects us a little bit. And I know not every state kind of has that flexibility within their statute to kind of work as Michigan does, though.
I don't know if I could get people to show up for a podcast on protest. It may just be me by myself, right? But I find the protest culture to be fascinating. If you look at, I can visualize certain states on the map, and they're completely, all of their process is built around what they perceive to be the ability to survive the protest process. And other places like Massachusetts have just flat said, like what you said, Jared, which is, we don't do protests. So it's very interesting, the span and how it affects, and ultimately, well, like I said, I could probably talk about protests by myself for an hour, and I may have to, because I think it affects people who are still sitting in the chairs, but that's a whole topic by itself.
I'm going to choose my words carefully. What I will say is I love protest. I think they are just unbelievably fascinating. I would agree with you. But I would add, they can be painful, of course. And however, the reason I love protest, it is important that everyone has an opportunity for appropriate due process. And state procurement officials should not be afraid of the protest process. It is merely a way for us to strengthen the process that is in place today. I love them.
With that, as we come towards the end, we talked today about different ways to do tool in the toolkit. We didn't talk about things like RFIs and RFPs. I'll quickly toss out that I think the problem with RFIs is that good vendors know that those are Freedom of Information Act-able, which is FOIA-able, and so they're unlikely to give you much response unless it's protected as part of the procurement process. So just realize that as you're doing RFIs. I've seen some places tie the requirement to do an RFP to response to an RFI so that it's then part of the procurement process. Does anybody do any? I know that was one of the things we said we might touch on. Anybody have anything interesting they do with RFIs that actually makes them useful?
This is Jenny. Massachusetts uses RFIs a lot to gather information, and for the big procurement for our enterprise systems that are going out, I think at the end of the week, we used an RFI process to really gather information about what vendors are out there and what they can do. And the information that came back was enormously helpful in finalizing our RFR that's going out. So I think as a way of gathering information, it's an excellent tool. Jenny out.
It's definitely an excellent tool. When we had to renew Atlanta bond program, and part of that program was beautifying the city with different art pieces. And we did an RFI to the art community just to get information on what type of, whether a statue or a painting would be good for certain areas, what type of art looks good around parks and trees versus under bridges and near railways. And from that RFI, we were able to determine, okay, we're going to put out an RFP for a statue at this location because the information told us that statues work best here, and this type of painting and designs in these locations because the information told us from our community that this is what works best on in these areas. So RFIs has helped me in the past.
Well, team, we're towards the top of the half hour, and I know some of you guys have been kind enough to reorganize your time so that you can carve out this precious block of yours. So I'll respect that and let you get into your next meetings. Topics are decided by the panelists. The topic about methods was one that people wanted to talk about, so that's what we did. So if you're listening or on LinkedIn and you have suggestions on topics, please feel free to chime in. We talked about sustainability in public procurement last week and use that associated with a survey that I've been running with our clients and some of our friends to try to build a profile. So if you're interested in those topics, please take a look at what we did a couple of weeks ago. And with that, I think we'll wrap it for the day. Thank you guys for your time, and look for us on the Public Procurement Change Agent podcast and on LinkedIn, and we'll see you next time. Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.